Hi there, and welcome to the business edition of PM Express with me, Philip Nanfuri. Now, in the past few days, we've been discussing the issue of Ghana's debt again. And a joint report by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank says Ghana's debt is at a high risk of distress. We ask ourselves, what does that mean exactly? We've heard from the policymakers, we've heard from the IMF itself, we've heard from economists, but we want to hear from the gentlemen within the newsroom, those who bring us the credible news. What exactly do they feel or think is wrong with Ghana when it comes to our finances and our debt? And to help me walk through this is our venerable editor, Wiafe, and also Emmanuel Wiafe on the Joy Business Desk. And the two of us are going to sift through the jargon and make you and I better informed on what exactly is going on with Ghana's debts. Because I know for the past 2 years, we've heard that we've been at a high risk of debt distress. Will that ever end? And apart from that, the media review is coming up shortly. We'll take a look at that. And last but not the least, the Monetary Policy Committee's decision, which we will get very soon on the rates and how it is going to affect interest rates in the economy. So it's a packed show tonight, but most importantly, we'll dwell on our debts and answer the question, is Ghana's debt deadly? This is the business edition of PM Express. My name is Philip. We'll be right back. Right, thanks for staying with us. So now the issue of debt is one that mostly makes the airwaves. And we keep on asking ourselves, if you look right here, you see this arrow going up and in red. And you ask yourself, is this the picture of Ghana's debt? Is this what it means when we talk about high-risk debt distress, debt going up? Everybody I know borrows once in a while. George does, Emmanuel does. But how come when a country borrows, there's always that problem? And how does a country's high debt affect you? How does it affect us? Why should we be concerned if a very fancy jargon that says our country is at a high risk of debt distress? What does that mean exactly? George will give us that explanation, and Emmanuel will tell us what exactly he makes of the situation when they say our country is at high risk of debt distress. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Hi, Philip.
Okay, so funny to be sitting here and Emmanuel is here, but anyway.
Right. I've always been giving you the question.
Yeah, I know.
Marketplace.
Eventually, you know. Yeah. Anyway, so George, high risk of debt distress keeps on coming up within our circles. We understand it because we cover the events and all that. When we say a country is at a high risk of debt distress, in simple terms, what does that mean?
So we are members of the IMF, we are members of the World Bank, and in trying to borrow and all the rest, the IMF would want to do a classification on each member countries on your ability simply to pay back your debt on time. So depending on the assets that you've built, depending on the fact that you've grown your economy, they want to measure that on the debts that you're taking, the money you're borrowing. So each and every time, these two institutions are doing an update that, let's take Philip as a country. How much debt have you taken on? And what would be your ability to pay back these debts on time? Are there any risk to your ability as Philip as a country to pay these debts on time? And therefore, they'll do this review every time just to tell development partners, investors, that when you are dealing with Philip as a country, these are his risks because he's taking on too much debt and you struggle to pay on time. So we have the low debt distress, you have the moderate, and you have the high risk of debt distress. It means that you are potentially just about 2 steps away in falling into that category where you will struggle. You have too much debt on your table that you'll not be able to get off these debts and pay them on time. So the fund is just saying that if you deal with country Philip, if you deal with country Ghana, they think that they've gotten to that status where they have become very risky, that they could get into that category that they are debt distress. And therefore, they could have some challenges in paying their debts, the money that they've borrowed from banks, investors, on time. And that is what I think they're trying to say.
Solid one there. Emmanuel, anytime this issue comes up, we have politicians, we have policymakers, economists, everybody comes with numbers, projections. Ghana's debt is high. Bank of Ghana's most recent report said our debt is about 198 billion Ghana cedis. We always hear from politicians, we always hear from economists. When you get the news of debt numbers, what do you make of it?
Well, for me, as an editor or where we sit, sometimes it's interesting, but trying to paint the picture to the ordinary person, I think that it is not a pleasant situation at all. You remember some time back we were described as a HIPIC nation or highly indebted poor country.
I was a baby back then, but anyway.
I know, right? And now if we are being described as, a high debt risk country, then it means that we are not out of the woods yet when it comes to borrowing to, pay for our targets or our projects that we have to do.
Okay.
So for me, it is not pleasant because these successive governments have gone through all the cyclical nature of borrowing, and we still do that. And when you look at, like I asked you the other day, I get amazed when, we have targets and we set outrageous or ambitious targets, and yet we have to go back and borrow. Why don't we set our targets within our limits? So I think that, as a country, we need to cut down on certain things. For instance, we know very well that a chunk of what we borrow goes to pay for, interest rates and interest payments and emoluments and so on and so forth. Yeah. So why don't we, and a little goes to capital expenditure, so we have to borrow for this capital expenditure. Sure. So why don't we set targets within our limits and then try to achieve them from time to time? So I think that it's not too pleasant as a country.
George, Imono makes a very good point about what Prof. Bokpin of University of Ghana will say, the fiscal rigidities, where we are stuck with 3 line items and all the money seems to be going there. I know personally that you are very interested in revenue and expenditure numbers. The debt issue seems to be, so our debt was wiped off in the HIPIC and then the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative times, when I said I was a baby. Then over time, we've been growing our debt, and our fiscal position, expenditure revenue doesn't seem to change. What do you make of that?
Well, the challenge is that, every country has to borrow. If you look at even the America and then the other developed economies, they borrow a lot. But what you have to ask yourself is that where are these monies going? Are they going into projects that they will pay for itself, or they are going into consumption? If investment have been made in certain projects and they are not getting the necessary returns on this investment, then you have to look at a situation where you have to go and borrow to consume. Because if you look at you talked about the rigidity, the fact that in terms of our expenditure, we raise revenue, a chunk of that has to go to paying salaries, a chunk of that has to go to servicing debt, then you're left with little to invest in capital projects that you think that it will pay back. You have about 6 million people that are supposed to pay their taxes. About 2 million are said to be paying their taxes. So you see that every time revenue is struggling. And if you don't mobilize enough revenue to meet your developmental needs, obviously you have to borrow. And that is where the challenge is. So you're not raising enough revenue internally. Some will say that it's more of a structural issue. You're not raising more revenue to meet all those targets. Then you have to look at borrowing. You have to go out and borrow. And the economy is expanding. More people are being born. The needs are rising each and every day. The worker of 10 years ago, public servant, and the worker of today, that person now wants more. Is that being measured with productivity in terms of that person also working to match what the person is being paid? So these expenses are rising each and every day. Developmental projects, we are talking about LECMA today. Certain regions now are saying that they need this and this and that. So the needs are rising each and every day. So if you're not raising enough revenue internally, then you are forced to do the Eurobonds, you are forced to go out for loans to deal with some of these needs that have arisen because the economy is expanding and we are not paying more. So these things are going to happen. Everybody's going to borrow. But the problem is, how are these borrowing being managed in a way that they will pay for itself? How are these borrowings being done in a way that it won't bring pressure on the economy? And that is how we've seen all these things come about, where now we are saying that, or they are saying that we are high risk of debt distress because most of these funds that are being borrowed are not being put into avenues or ventures or projects that will pay for itself. And therefore, the debts will continue to rise. But again, you won't take certain things away from this government, successive government, that you've seen that some strategies are being put in place to try and again, what we'll talk about, the fact that lending a yield, okay, well, let me break it down, trying to extend the period for paying these debts. Because it got to a point when it was so bad that whoever is managing the economy, there's even little room to think about how do you even get fresh revenue or money to do with developmental projects or even capital expenditure? You have a situation where everything that you raise in revenue, you are paying salaries and paying debt, and that's all. There is little left for you as a manager of the economy to even invest. So what do? You try and lengthen the yield curve or actually delay the period for paying some of these debts so that you have some space to think about how to apply some of these money. So some would say that it's about revenue, but also you'd want to blame sometimes those who are managing the economic space about how these funds are borrowed and where they are invested.
Emmanuel, he makes a very good point. So the first one about people are being born. I know you have a personal story there, but I would just keep my lips sealed. On the issue of revenue, in the 2017 budget, a number of tax measures or taxes which were deemed nuisance in inverted commas were taken off, and some new ones were brought in. You and I have discussed on your show Marketplace the realignment and capping of earmarked funds. We saw also the luxury tax, the luxury tax on luxury vehicles, which some are contesting as to what exactly
that means.
If you had the reins of the economy, Emmanuel, and you were asked to put measures in place with revenue, what would you look at?
As a finance minister,
well, I wish.
Or the governor of the bank.
It actually tells us that we are very handicapped when it comes to revenue mobilization, and yet we continue to set targets. You know, from last year, for instance, we set a target of 36 billion Ghana cedis.
That's a GRA.
That's a GRA, yeah, I mean GRA. And now we are at 45 billion Ghana cedis. Now, we realize that there are so many areas that, in the first place, as much as we try to limit or reduce the number of ghost names, for instance, to also reduce the extent to which we pay, you know,
these salaries
and emoluments, we are still constrained because the number of people within the tax net or the number of people which are supposed to pay taxes are limited. Even though we pay lip service to this particular situation, it's still wrong. I mean, it's still far from reach. So we realize that as a country, we really need to put our feet down well, firmly. Now, we are lucky because for now, revenue from commodities like oil and gas, you know, is good because even though the benchmark revenue set at the beginning of the year is quite, you know, is over the benchmark now, what we see currently, and we have commodities like cocoa and we have other sources of revenue coming in place, we still have a long way to go because we are still not processing our raw material, our commodities, and it's a source of worry, it's a source of concern. So as much as we have to, you know, try to maximize revenue to be able to offset some of this expenditure, it is a source of concern. It's still a problem, you understand? And if I am the finance minister, I will, like I said earlier, I would really cut, my objectives. I'll cut my quote according to my size, maybe, so to speak. Because if I know that this is the extent to which I can, you know, mobilize revenue, and then I set my targets to
that level, and then there's no wide, because that also comes with the fiscal deficit implications, and now we have this capping of 5% for our fiscal deficit. But we'll take a quick break now. When we get back, we'll jump into this conversation. This is the business edition of PM Express. My name is Philip Nanfuri, and my guests are very own assistant editors, George Wiafe and Emmanuel Wiafe, on the Joy Business Desk. We'll be right back. Right, welcome back. This is the business edition of PM Express with me, Philip Nanfuri. Now, before we went to the break, we're looking at the stark reality of government's finances and our debt situation. Over the course of 3 financial years, 2007, 2018, and now 2019, government has put in place a number of measures to streamline their expenditure, rake in more revenue, and improve their debt. I put together a little infographic just to keep us up to date, particularly from the 2017 budget, when this new government came in place, on how they were going to manage the expenditure, the revenue, and the debt. Let's take a look at this. Right. So that's just a snapshot of what the government put in place in the 2017 budget. And I want to find out from Emmanuel. One thing that stood out was the establishment of the Fiscal Council, and that has already been set in motion. But the key question asked all the time is, will that have the teeth to ensure that government's finances are put in place? Because with poor finances, there's the issue of debt, like George mentioned. So we borrow, we don't use properly, then it multiplies itself and it goes on and on. Emmanuel, a fiscal council, a group of eminent men, led by, if I'm right, former governor of the Bank of Ghana, Dr. Paul Akwa. Do you think such an institution, such a body, will help governments with its finances?
Well, I mean, like we always say, we have all the regulations, but the commitment to implement them is the problem. And so now a fiscal council, I think, is more appropriate and very, very judicious, because over time we have heard that our expenditures by various or successive governments have gone overboard, especially when it comes to election period. And the IMF and the World Bank have raised concerns that within these periods we spend or overspend too much. So if we have taken the bold step to set up a fiscal council, it is a step in the right direction. But the most important thing is, would we be committed to implement the ideals of the law or the fiscal council? That is a major problem. If we don't do it, then it becomes a white elephant, and it's just there. You understand? Because at this stage, we really need to manage our resources well, because we are not earning more. We are not getting enough revenue. So if the little revenue that we are raising, we are not also managing it well, then it becomes a very big problem. And that is where I think that governments touting the fact that we are going beyond aid and things becomes just like a lip service. Because I took a piece of information here from the Ministry of Finance website. It says, to address this debt problem, government will diversify its sources of external borrowing by accessing international capital markets by way of issuing Century Bond, Green Bond, Samurai Bond, Panda, among others, which to me indicates that we are never going to cease borrowing.
Just to pick up from where we are saying,
yes, this is the medium-term debt management strategy.
Yes, true.
In terms of regulations, and there's always said that Ghana might be one of the best countries if you're talking about giving international prize or Guinness Book of Record in terms of putting in place regulations, laws and all the rest. But often the challenge has been complying and commitment to live to the spirit and the letter of these regulations. And that's where the problem is, because the latest one is the Public Financial Administration Act. And if you talk about all the laws that's supposed to check to promote fiscal discipline and prudence and all the rest, but I stand to be educated. I've never seen this country in my lifetime, and I use the word to be educated, where we have a balanced budget. There is always a deficit.
There is a deficit.
I think economically it is not.
I mean, we've seen some countries like Germany have a balanced budget. But I'm just saying that it's like a norm. If you don't have a high deficit, then own your government. So that is where my problem is, that put in place all the laws, but live to those laws. I mean, there are punishments in place if we overspend as a country, whoever is managing that economic space. But what happens? Every year, Prime Minister will go to Parliament, approve X amount of money for me. They'll come the next year with a high budget deficit, and the members of Parliament will say, go and spend 70 billion. So enough has not been done to check those ministries that submit X amount of requests to spend, and they end up overspending. What are the punishments in place, which is supposed to be captured in the Public Financial Administration Act? What happens to those ministries? Are you going to put measures in place to ensure that when they come back next year, you won't get what you apply for because you are going to overspend? What are the measures being put in place to ensure that ministries, agencies that overspend, that end up ballooning the national budget, they are dealt with? The laws are there. We have beautiful laws. We have fine regulations. Do this, do that, present the mid-year review, do a supplementary budget, come to Parliament for every tax that you want to introduce. But what happens? Good thing going out to borrow. You want to, again, leave the domestic space for local businesses. But the problem, to crowd them out. But the problem is that if those measures are not in place to stabilize your local currency, that is a big problem. If you look at our total debt stock, sometimes it's not because of fresh borrowing, but the fact that depreciation of the cedi, it's a major problem. So it looks like we are too much exposed. We are not doing enough to diversify our exports earn more FX or foreign currencies to shore up our reserves. So yes, it's good to go out and borrow, but if your currency is not strong, it is more of a death trap. Let me just read one quick thing in the World Bank latest report that they issued on Ghana. It said the standard stress test suggests that Ghana is particularly vulnerable to decline in exports, confirming the need to diversify the economy. Now, this same report, after doing the debt sustainability analysis, is now saying that we are high risk. And even doing the extrapolation to do the outlook, things are not good for us. And they are saying that those things that could have earned us revenue to deal with this is also under stress.
Okay.
And it's a problem there.
So maybe to add to what George is saying, I think that like I was saying earlier, we really need to ensure that these statutes within the law work. Now, are we ready as a nation or as a government to crack the whip on our own people for mismanaging funds or resources of the state? Because if that has been captured in the law and the necessary punitive measures are in place, are you ready to let them go on these people if they are found culpable? Now, if we are not, then it makes it very, very funny. The whole law very funny. Now, we heard recently that the Minister of Finance has not been able to account for some amount of money, by the PIAC, some amount of
that's the Public Interest Accountability Committee.
Public Interest Accountability Committee. Now, as of now, the ministry has not been able to tell the PIAC where that amount of money is. Now we're going to go into another budget, subsequent budget, and this one we brought forward. And then we don't know, we are not being able to account for it. You understand? So if the law is there, let the law work. It doesn't have to be just the Yoko or Strach, but let the financial laws work.
I asked this question, yes or no answer. I'll start with you, Emmanuel. Is Ghana's debt situation deadly? Yes or no?
Yes or no?
Yes or no?
I will say no.
George, Ghana's debt situation deadly? Yes or no?
It depends on the
yes
context.
or no, but I still want to qualify the explanation about whether it's yes or no, because again, for those institutions that want to do the assessment on you as a country, they are saying that it's bad. I think it's deadly, because if you look at the fact that a chunk of what we are raising is going to service interest payments. The budget is talking about somewhere around 18 billion or 17 billion. I stand to be corrected. That anytime you raise revenue, if you raise about 1 Ghana cedi revenue, a chunk of that is going to service interest on debts that you've borrowed. And that is where the problem is. So if you don't raise enough revenue internally, I ask myself, is it a human resource problem? Is it a structural problem? Or the money is finding into the pockets of some people instead of coming into the national coffers? You look at property rates. Come to East Legon, and the buildings that are there, and they are still not paying property. You understand me? So that is where the problem is. Whether we just don't want to collect the revenue, it's difficult for us to collect, or because we are granting too much exemptions to businesses that are supposed to be paying these taxes. So the buck stops with it's revenue, and it's revenue.
I would say the term deadly is relative, because when you say deadly, it's
so
very serious.
So on government's debt, before we move on to media review, do you think we are in the red? Do you think you are keeping your eyes peeled? Do you think we are in the green? Do you think you don't know where we are going? Or do you think there's a star to be given to government? One each for you.
I think we are in the red. I think that I'm worried that if we take a chunk
John says we're in the red. Sabaji, you want to keep your eyes peeled?
We have to keep our eyes
peeled. If we are taking a chunk of the revenue and you have to even deal with, listen, apart from wage bill, I think then, and again, sorry, I'm using this word, that it's the next biggest spending item on the budget.
Yeah, wage bill, interest payment.
But you see, don't let us forget that we are also servicing the debts.
I understand.
You understand? So the debt is not
I appreciate that.
Yes, servicing the
yes,
debts.
the finance minister will talk about legacy issues, and it's a fact. Yes, we are not saying that it was this government that caused the debt. I think that let it be made clear. It's not about this government, or it's all the government that we've had. What has been their commitment in containing the debt situation? And if you have a chunk of the revenues that you are taking, they are not going into development projects. We are here talking about LECMA. There's so much rigidity in the system that where is the money going to come from? You understand me? And yes, we have to borrow. I mean, in Chi, they'll say that, So let nobody get it wrong that we are condemning government for borrowing. No. Everyone has to borrow. You borrow to develop. But you are borrowing because you are not raising enough revenue internally. And why are we not raising enough revenue internally? Because people don't want to pay. Because we are not challenging ourselves, because people have seen loopholes in the system and they are exploiting it. We've had people who are at the center of managing revenue space and they are compromised.
Okay, well, let's give one of the last bite on this topic and then move on.
Watching, because the government is not just sitting down. I mean, from what we hear as editors, when we see the stories that we churn out every day, the government is not just sitting down idle. It is moving to do something about the management of the debt crisis. We've seen profiling of debts. We've seen cutting down a bit on expenditure patterns. Yes. And then we've also seen introduction of some taxes.
I don't think that anyone. No, I don't think that anyone is trying to good work. I mean, that's why I'm saying that I want to approach this debt issue about what everybody
and that's
has
why
done.
I will not use it.
You understand me? I think that yes, Ken is doing what he has to do. Yeah. And sometimes I pity some of the finance ministers having been close to them about the pressure that is on them and what they have to do. But well, that is private. You understand me? But my problem is, you when you look at all the loopholes in the revenue net, you don't understand that whether there's some commitment to deal with that challenge.
Okay.
You understand me? Instead of going out to borrow very high rates, and we have to service that these monies that should have gone into projects, we have to look at servicing these there, because don't forget, there's already a report card out there by the rating agencies and even the IMF and the World Bank. So you dare not default on these debts. So if, for instance, LECMA needs good roads and you have to channel X amount of money to LECMA, your commitment due dates are coming that you have to use that money, 17 or 18 billion. That is serious. That is unheard of.
Okay. So you've heard it all on whether Ghana's debt is deadly or not. Emmanuel says he wants to keep his eyes peeled, and he used this. He's keeping his eyes peeled on the debt issue to know where exactly it's going. George Wiafe says, no, we're in the red, and we must be cautious. What do I think? Well, I'll leave that to myself. We're going to jump onto the next part of our discussion, the mid-year budget review. And in the course of the week, we at Joy Business did a breaking it down on what exactly the mid-year review meant. And it's simply a check on where government has come from since they presented the last budget. If they need more money to carry out their expenditures, then they have to come to Parliament for approval. But they have to come and give us an update. But with this update comes the possibility of a reintroduction of new taxes. And I'm sure you've seen in other mid-year reviews where new taxes have been snuck into the budget. And you ask yourself, what's going on? Like we saw last year where we had the luxury tax, etc. What are we going to expect this coming mid-year budget review? George, you are the man on the ground.
No, we are all on the ground, man.
You have your ears.
Eventually, we are all on the ground. And again, it comes to the Public Financial Administration Act, which actually these are regulations that's
Act 921
that will guide the finance minister and everything that the finance minister has to do. We talked about regulation. Even if the finance minister has to drink water that will have an impact on public finances, those things are spelled out in the regulation. So the regulation is saying that before July 31, the minister should come to Parliament and update the Ghanaian public through Parliament. Since the last time you presented the budget, update us. You understand me? You set out certain macroeconomic targets. Are we on track to meet those targets? If we are not on track, do you have to cut some expenditure, do some adjustment? Because don't forget that when you go out there to tell the whole public, investors and development partners that you want to end the year of not spending X amount of money to what has been projected, of ensuring that you end the year with an inflation target of maybe 8.5%. People want to take those numbers and plan. So if consistently the year ends and you are breaching those numbers, there are credibility issues. And I don't think it's good for us. So if it's clear that half year, you're planning to raise like 45 billion Ghana cedis. Half year, you're doing about 16 billion or even 10 billion. These are just rough estimates.
Okay.
It is clear that, Philip, you won't end the year meeting the target unless something else happens. Sometimes, and these are just assumptions. So come to Parliament, update us. Now, what we are hearing, because if you follow the budget presentation, sometimes even an hour to presentation, some things can change. What we are hearing, and the economists want to say, all other things being equal, that there could be a supplementary budget. It means that possibly some fresh revenues have come in. And again, get back to the Public Financial Administration Act, is saying that even if you want to spend 1 pesewa, Parliament has to approve it. So if extra revenue has come in from different areas, you want to come to Parliament and say, members of Parliament, $1,000 has come in, give me approval to spend that. And if those numbers are going to come in, they will change the whole expenditure revenue dynamics. So you were hoping that with X amount of revenue coming in, the budget deficit to be this. Now that extra revenue is coming in, that would impact on the budget deficit. So come to Parliament and update me. During that process of updating, if you think that luxury tax was not bringing the revenue that you wanted and you want to review that and change that, come to Parliament and say that based on what has happened to this tax, it is not working. Therefore, I want to scrap it. I want to change the name. I want to make sure that it affects Abuaji's vehicle, because that is
come to him on that.
because that's a luxury vehicle and he's not being charged, so he has to pay the tax. So you want to look at all these things, and that is what the minister would be doing again, all other things being equal, on Monday that is supposed to do the presentation now.
Okay.
Well, clearly, I would want the finance minister to put or to set the record straight. You know, I wouldn't want a situation where, for instance, the other day the vice president said benchmark values are this, and then eventually, you know, realize that that does not reflect in the real numbers at the ports. So I want the finance minister to tell us clear facts that one, we targeted 45 billion for the year. Halfway through, we've been able to realize this amount, and that moving forward, we will be able to do this when we implement this policy. Now, I would also want him to also clearly state the luxury vehicle tax, categorize it well, because it looks like there's been so much.
Yes.
Wiafe is worried about it because it has implications on his vehicle that he's paying the tax or not. Yes.
Because automobile owners are crying. You know, sometimes the way the classification is leaves much to be desired. So I think that the finance minister must come clear with that. Now, one other major area that he also has to highlight is the petroleum revenue, because he set a target or a benchmark value of, I think, around 57 or so, but now we are within 60s, even though we've had volatility in the prices, you know, but we've had some increase, and then we are also having working on some, you know, upcoming fields, even though it's quite a long-term field, but these are or will show up revenue from petroleum. So tell us straight what we expect to have here through, what are we getting, and what are we going to, you know, use these monies that we're getting for? Are we going to cut down on some expenditure patterns, some capex, or are we still adding on? Because people are.
I like the luxury vehicle tax because of the ambiguity it has brought.
Exactly.
And you realize that some automobile heads as in people who are familiar with that industry have the opinion that you have a vehicle that may not necessarily be luxury in its features, but has an engine capacity of 3 liters and above. And I think it will be prudent to rework that and define it properly.
If it has to do with engine capacity, let's know. If it has to do with, you know, features, luxury features within the vehicle, let's know. That's clear. Because you don't go to
but Philip, also, as a nation, let's come to the realization, or let's come to the point where we take a decision on whether I would want to be taxed so we can use those monies to develop the country, or we want to go out and borrow, because you are the same people who would borrow, who would complain when
we are being taxed.
When we are being taxed, when we are going out to borrow to Nana borrow and all the rest people coming. But you see, so let's get to that point where we agree that I'm prepared to pay X amount of taxes because I want it to be used to develop the economy. But the caveat there, Philip, is that also they want to see these monies being used for what they're supposed to be used for. When you find out that Auditor General's report is coming out every year and how public finances are being wasted with great impunity, I'm worried when somebody wants to tax me. When I bring in a certain good and I'm being asked to pay X amount of taxes, are people that committed to pay taxes? Because if you see some of the things that are going on, and I'm basing my comment on the Auditor General's report, not about all the hearsays that we find out in the media, because when you're in the media room, you hear lots of things. But the Auditor General support, and when you go through not just the political corruption, but from the top to the down, district assemblies, municipal assemblies, chief directors, state agencies, and you're worried that if I'm being asked to pay X amount of money to help develop the economy, who is ensuring that when I pay 1,000 Ghana cedis to the state, it goes to the consolidated fund to be used for what is being called? Listen, we need to come to the realization that, listen, should we pay? Because if you want to go out and borrow, yes, it's good to borrow, but the repercussions, we are still servicing debts that were borrowed 10 years ago. And that is why when you want to do a whole classification of public debt, that's what the finance minister was talking about, legacy debts. These are debts that were taken 20 years ago, 10 years ago,
which we need
Euro bonds that we are still servicing. So let's tell ourselves, listen, the Americas are developing because you stay there, they will tax you. You live in UK, you work in UK, you know it. You take and you look at the council tax, the local tax and everything is taken off because every citizen there is contributing to the national pot. If you don't want to pay the taxes, then you decide on either you do the deep blue sea or the hard rock.
I think I would also want the finance minister to also tell us that the interventions that he put in place for, roping in more people to pay tax, to what extent is it working? The classification of taxpayers and all these electronic measures of paying taxes, has it really yielded results? Has it helped? To what extent has it helped? Now, agric is also another area that I think finance minister will have to really tell us, because government has come out with so many interventions. We have, recently the rearing for food and livestock, so many of them. Now, we are hearing, or we sit here and we hear diverse, reactions. People are saying, well, it's yielding results. People are saying, no, it's not doing too much to the economy. So let the finance minister tell us, the planting for food and jobs, has it increased productivity? Has it increased yields? Maize? What specific crops or foodstuffs are you?
This is the business edition of PM Express. My name is Philip Nanfuri, and my guest, our very own Joy business editors, George Wiafe, assistant editor, and Emmanuel Abaje Wiafe, assistant editor also. We're taking a quick break. We'll be right back. Right, thanks for staying with us. This is a business edition of PM Express. As we delve into the last leg of our conversation, we want to look at the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of Ghana. They set an interest rate, which is supposed to steer the interest rates within the Ghanaian economy. And it's of particular interest to media people and the business community because it gives a gauge of where interest rates in the economy are going to go. We've looked at our debts, we've looked at the media review, and want to touch on this and wrap up the show. So I'll throw it to George first, because before I even joined multimedia, anytime I tune into Joy to listen to the Monetary Policy Committee meetings, I find our good editor giving us the information. George,
the facts and the figures.
16% is the current rate. What do we expect from this?
Well, just backtrack a little bit. So why do we should always make noise and care? Certain distinguished gentlemen chaired by the governor of the Bank of Ghana, they meet over 3 days, they analyze data and all the rest, and they announce a policy rate. Why should I care? Because that is the rate at which the Bank of Ghana are lending to commercial banks, and the belief is that it's supposed to influence the cost of credit in the country. So what does the policy committee do? They analyze all the data available to them, and since you are practicing a policy of what we call inflation targeting, what can you do as managing the monetary space to ensure that you check the amount of money in circulation, because it has an impact on the general price levels, has impact on inflation. So whatever policies that you want to put in place, i.e. mopping up excess currency in circulation, doing all those things, is all geared towards checking inflation. Using this monetary policy or policy rate, which they lend to these banks, they hope that if the rate is high, it would discourage people from borrowing. That's a perception, and therefore we can use that to again suck excess money in circulation. If it's low and you're bringing it down, you want to stimulate lending to grow the economy. So doing all the assessment, we'll get the debt numbers, we'll let them see whether the economy is that healthy and all the rest. They would settle on a new policy rate. It is believed that if the rate goes up, then the bank within the next 3 months, they are worried that there are some threat to the economy. So hike the rates and use that to check blending in the system. They think that they want the economy to grow. There are no threats to inflation and general price levels. We want to bring the rates down a little bit to stimulate growth and lending for private sector. Now, inflation is coming down. At their last meeting, the expectation was that something, cedi's depreciation and all the rest, we will see inflation going up. On the contrary, it's declining. Some data that I'm seeing also indicates that just over the past 3 days or something, the cedi has seen some strong appreciation because of what is happening in the US. The expectation that rates are going to go down.
True.
These investors who invest in our bonds, they are bringing in some FX into the Vostro accounts. So these are accounts that they remit monies in for these local banks to purchase the bonds on their behalf. So something has happened that which we thought would be a threat to the cedi, and the cedi is fairly stable.
Okay.
So there's a likelihood, if you listen to what the analysts are saying, that if the MPC chaired by the governor of the Bank of Ghana would be want to be cautiously watch the numbers, they might hold the rate. If again they do all their extrapolations, they could bring the rate down marginally, because if the cedi is strengthened, if inflation is no longer a threat, then why don't you bring the rates down so you stimulate some? Because there's this perception that the system is still dry, it's tough, so you want to stimulate lending a little bit. So maybe 50 or 100% basis points. Yeah.
Well, so for me, I mean, generally, I mean, to the ordinary person, once again, I mean, why do we set prime rate or policy rate?
Yeah.
You know, we all know that the basic reason is to influence cost of doing business, so to speak, because it actually influences interest rates either going down or going up. Now, to what extent, once again, have we or have interest rate or policy rates affected the cost of doing business? We've seen over the past months, you know, the policy rate either has been held or has moved down or otherwise. But have we seen a commensurate increase or decrease in the cost of doing business? It's very difficult, and that's the reason why some time ago some analysts were prescribing what happened in Kenya, that we cap interest rates for the private sector to be able to, you know, go out to borrow.
But that didn't actually work for them in the long run.
Well,
it made Kenya's situation far worse off. But anyway.
So you see, it's interesting because now the finance minister has assured us that the country is on target or is on course at meeting the 8% targets by the end of the year, which is good for, you know, the prime rate or the policy rate to be lowered. So I think that if looking at the trend at which, or the way at which the inflation rate has been dwindling marginally, if it goes on like that, then of course what the finance minister is saying is true. It means we could achieve the 8% target. And obviously, looking at the trend now, I think that the policy rate should be lowered. I think that it should be lowered, maybe by 50 or 100 basis points, so that it influences more.
It stimulates.
It's interesting
lending.
because now you go to the bank. I mean, I visited the bank and their interest rates have come down. It's a sign that the banks are
responding.
So
will you go and borrow?
Oh well, it depends on what I'm going to borrow for. If I want to borrow for a project, I will pay for it.
Wiafe made a very interesting point about the cost of doing business and the transmission mechanism. That if you look over the months, there have been some consistent reduction in the cost of credit. Why are we still not feeling it? Because other factors that also influences the cost of credit is not going down. Non-performing loans is a critical thing. I mean, today in Parliament, Honorable Kennedy Japan was talking about the fact that Guta should boycott the banks because rates are high. If you still have people borrowing and they are not paying back, the banks have to find a way to price it when they are lending. If you have government that is not paying back contractors, it's priced into the cost of credit. If the economy, inflation is high, now inflation is coming down. You understand me? So there are other critical indicators that if they don't reduce, policy rates can come down to like 10%, and we will still complain that cost of credit is high in this country. So NPLs, government should pay those contractors. I know that government want to manage inflation because if you put in too much money into the system and it's not measured commensurate with productivity, you're rather going to kill the economy than expand the economy.
I think I saw a list recently which actually named and shamed some people who have borrowed from banks and are not
yeah,
paid.
but still NPS was high. Despite they're trying to write off some of these debt, about 7 billion or 7.5 or even 6 billion, that these are monies that the banks themselves fear would not be paid. That is huge.
But I think the rate, it's
come down because there's been a decision to write off some of these
about
debts.
2 billion plus.
So that will bring it down to like 6 billion Ghana cedis. But if inflation is high, now inflation is down, if all those things address systems, because the default rate is very, very high. So Philip Bank would still want to maintain the rate at X amount because people are not paying those loans back. So if you don't deal with all those things, policy rates could come down to even like 1%, but people will complain that cost of credit is something else.
Okay, so for our card segment, mid-year and monetary policy. For the mid-year, if you take a reg, you think it's another talk shop, nothing's going to happen. You want to keep your eyes peeled. If you think something good is going to happen, you take the green. If you think government has done so well, you give them a star. If you think they don't know where they're going, you give them in the direction onward.
I think I'm watching, and if you engage,
for the mid-year.
If you engage, this should be a make or break in terms of trying to readjust the challenges because revenue is not doing well. So he has to use this supplementary mid-year budget to correct those macroeconomic challenges, and that has to be fixed right now. Don't forget that we are going into an election year. Well, we don't know what will happen. So this is the time to fix all those challenges with the economy to convince the electorates that, listen, they can manage the economy again in the next half or quarter.
I believe that something good is going to happen. Why? Because the government has started itself of being a listening government. I'm not doing any politics here. but then we have seen indications. For instance, the luxury vehicle tax. I mean, we've seen indications or heard indications that the finance minister is reacting to the concerns of some of these automobile owners, which, I mean, and that is not the only situation. There are other areas that also the government should be commended. So with these things in place, I believe that we could hear something exactly that will appease the public. So
gentlemen, I want to say a very, very big thank you. It's not easy to have your editors on your show and then hosting them. This has been the business edition of PM Express. My name is Philip Manfuri, and my guest, Wiafe, assistant editor, Joy Business, and Emmanuel Wiafe, also an assistant editor of the Joy Business. I hope you had a good conversation. Have a good evening.